today. He has a wonderful presentation. And I know, especially with my internet dropping, that we're starting a little bit later than we had anticipated. So I will just jump into it in one brief second. So first, I would like to say we will be having time for questions and answers. We'll be holding those at the end of this lecture. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. Our team will be monitoring that. We'll also be monitoring the raising of hands at the end, so we can be sure to include your voices into the conversation. Oh, also, I realized, because I was a little scatterbrained being kicked off internet, I work in the Diversity Inclusion Student Center. I neglected to mention that, which is underneath the University Diversity Office, which we have a couple of our teammates on here now. Kim Baker-Flowers, who is our University Diversity Officer, and then Liam Hawkyard, who is the office manager, and I think he's the Lord of the Internet or something like that, Kim has dubbed him. Anyway, we we work to bring a series of events like this to you all, and we appreciate the support. And we're happy to provide the community and the opportunity for connection, even though we're not necessarily doing it in the way that we would like. Being in the same space, we're here to help bridge us together and help us to learn and grow as a community. So we have more of these lectures. If you're into this sort of a thing, we have more lectures coming up next semester. We have Alicia Garza in January. She'll be our first one. She's January 28th. She is one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. We have Melissa Harris Perry in February. We have Robin DiAngelo in March. We have Scott Turner Schofield for LGBTQ plus Awareness Month. And then we have Auntie Pua Case for Api Mesa Month. So if you're interested in attending more lectures like this, please visit the DISC website and click on Cultural Awareness Months. And there's a link right there where you can register online, and we will send you the link and you can come and join us on Zoom. So without further ado, I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce Julian and then let him take it away. So Julian Brave NoiseCat is Director of Green New Deal Strategy for Data for Progress, a think tank and narrative change director for the Natural History Museum, an artist and activist collective. He is also a correspondent for Real America with Jorge Ramos and a contributing editor for the Canadian Geographic. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Julian, and the mic is yours.
Wade up. It's very exciting to be speaking to you all. I'm originally from Oakland, so Cal State East Bay is obviously right next door to where I grew up. Just make sure I have my slides set up here. Sorry, I'm a young person, but I'm not very good at the tech stuff all the time. All right. Just to start, I guess I'll introduce myself in my own language, which feels like probably the most appropriate way to begin Native Heritage Month, and then I'll hop into my my talk here. But Wade up, Julian Brave NoiseCat when squext, when Kika Squest were Alexander Radief, when Kakachet Squest were Erarchi NoiseCat, Sequachmok and Statland Ken, to Eskin, which Dequin, to Oakland, which Dequin. Letwin Poopsman Eliatik Tumich where Piscataway Uluch where Echwa Washington DC. Hello everyone, my name is Julian Brave NoiseCat. My father's name is Ed Archie NoiseCat and my mother's name is Alexandra Roddy. Among my people, we usually introduce who our ancestors are, so I just introduced my parents. Because that's usually how we relate to each other, is as relatives and through family trees and those sorts of things. My people are the Secwepemc and St'át'imc nations in what is now British Columbia, Canada. But I actually grew up in, as I said, Oakland, California. When I first hopped on this call, actually, I had to take off my Raiders cap because I felt like it would be a little, it wasn't formal enough, even though we're all secretly just hanging out in our sweatpants and slippers at home. I wanted to take off the hat to acknowledge that I'm going to give a keynote lecture from my my breakfast nook in my little apartment. So I'm calling today from Piscataway traditional territory, what is now Washington, DC, which is where I live and work now. And I would like to acknowledge that Cal State East Bay is also on the lands of the Ohlone people. I think it's really important that we, especially this month, but of course always, acknowledge the histories of the lands that we're on, and that's obviously the indigenous history, but also you know, in this country, the history of enslaved people and others who made this place into what it is, which is a very complicated story. Today, the talk that I'm going to give is called Chuchwinuch, and Chuchwinuch is the traditional morning greeting in my people's language, the Secwepemc language, a language that has fewer than 200 remaining fluent speakers, and which I have been fortunate enough to learn part of from my grandmother, who was taken away when she was a small girl on the back of a cattle truck to a residential school, where she was told that she should not speak her language, that she should not acknowledge that she is Indian, and that these things were bad. And through that history, and despite that history, she has retained her language and now actually teaches it to young people in our family and on our reserve. And Chuchwinuch, usually it's translated as good morning, but what it actually literally means is you survived the night. You survived the night, which I think is a really powerful, obviously as someone who writes, I think words are powerful things. And I think that, you know, saying that, I imagine, you know, what it must have meant for my ancestors to say, you survived the night, after mornings where our children were taken away to residential schools, after mornings where entire homes full of people died from smallpox, after mornings where our lands were taken away from us, and our future looked bleak. You know, saying that you survived the night was a very, I think, profound statement, sometimes in the depths of the history that we endured. And the lecture that I'm going to give today, it's not particularly linear, actually. It's going to take us all across Indian country, from Wounded Knee to Oakland to Alcatraz, and maybe a few places in between, if I remember correctly, and try to give a sort of broad outline through my reporting and journalism of what I think the indigenous sort of story is today, and why it matters to people who aren't just native people. So we're going to begin in, oh, I got to figure out how to change the slides. Oh, there's the button. All right, here we go. That's my cat, the one who teaches me the language. So on a chilly and overcast Saturday in March of 2019, almost 2 years ago now, I parked my rental car at the base of the hill in Wounded Knee. That's on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The week before, historic blizzard and gust, winds up to 70 miles per hour, had piled snowbanks atop soil frozen as solid as concrete. And in some places along the highway, the snowpack stood taller than the vehicles that were motoring past. When that snow melted under the torrential rains of a bomb cyclone, the creeks that nourish Pine Ridge overflowed their banks. Climate change, which shifts jet streams and leads to greater ocean evaporation and Midwest precipitation, is making biblical storms like that one more likely on the arid plains. Flooded and mucky back roads on Pine Ridge cut families off from medicine, food, water, and outside assistance. Water lines broke all over the reservation. An official advisory from the Oglala Nation warned of fecal contamination in tap water and other disease-causing organisms, and directed residents to boil their water for 3 minutes before use. The New York Times reported 8,000 without potable water. And then a place that routinely tops the list of some of the poorest places in the United States, which one study actually likened to a post-disaster landscape. The deluge turned systemic injustices into death sentences. The Times reported at least 3 fatalities as a result of that catastrophe. South Dakota and the Oglala Nation declared a state of emergency. On Bigfoot Trail that day in March, a highway at the foot of Wounded Knee's Hill, residents of the Wounded Knee houses whose water main was broken during the flood passed me on a pilgrimage to a nearby post office where they queued up to collect rations for the National Guard. Earlier that day, Governor Kristi Noem had rolled onto the reservation right past my rental car, actually, with a convoy of Humvees loaded with tanks of water. The governor's official Twitter account posted images of the state's top executive filling water jugs, chatting with soldiers, and listening to tribal members. But many on the reservation felt her concerns to be insincere and the photo ops to be opportunistic. 2 weeks earlier, Noem had rushed to pass a bill that would penalize protesters, or what the state called riot boosters, for opposing projects like TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline, if they participated in or even tangentially were connected to a quote unquote violent protest. Many tribes like the Oglala oppose the Keystone XL pipeline and say Noem's legislation violates the First Amendment. The ACLU sued the state actually and argued that the law was unconstitutional. Here's a quote: "We are particularly offended that you consulted TransCanada before introducing these bills, but failed to consult the Oglala Sioux tribe or any of the sovereign bands of the Sioux Nation, though our treaty lands would be traversed and endangered by the Keystone XL pipeline." That was from Oglala Tribal Chairman Julian Bear Runner, and he said it in a letter to the governor. Flooding, broken pipes, and widespread suffering caused by the disaster only seemed to vindicate Bear Runner and his tribe. Months later, following legal injunction, Noem and the state attorney general filed a settlement agreement with the plaintiffs, nullifying most of the legislation. And as I took in this scene, Jarrett Jealous, a friendly middle-aged father, approached, offering to sell some of his wares: handmade dream catchers, carved antler keychains, and buttons fashioned from elk bone. I turned down his pitch, so he took another tack, volunteering information about the monument and the best way to march up the muddy hill. As Jarrett talked, a man named Cody and Cody's girlfriend and a pup that they found on the side of the road, all residents of the Wounded Knee tribal housing, came up to ask if I had any water. I gave them one of the big bottles stashed in my back seat. Then a 10-year-old named Raymond Eaglehawk, also a Wounded Knee resident, stopped and offered me a story. He spoke of Lost Bird, an infant who miraculously survived the massacre and blizzard in 1890. Some say she was one of the 2 infants found beneath mother's frozen bodies that day. Adopted by the abusive General Leonard Colby, Lost Bird lived an impoverished and ill-fated life. She contracted syphilis and died, likely of influenza, at 29. When he finished, Eaglehawk asked if I could spare $10 for his trouble. Shocked by the bluntness and brutality of the adolescent's tale, I obliged. And then I trudged up that hill, the mud sucking at the heels of my Ariat ropers. At the top, 75 feet long and about 75 feet long and 15 feet wide, bordered by a thin slab of concrete and surrounded by a chain link fence, there's a mass grave that holds the remains of 146 Lakota people. Outside of the fence is a humble monument erected by descendants of the slain in 1903. It's inscribed with the names of 43 victims. It says, quote, "Many innocent women and children who knew no wrong died here." This was my first visit to Wounded Knee, a place that as a young Native man and writer, I had heard and read so much about. Notepad and pen in hand, I was determined to find meaning here. My pilgrimage, I hoped, might reveal some higher purpose hidden within our seemingly endless Indian losses. But when I reached the burial site, I removed my Chicago Bulls cap. Excuse me. When I reached the burial site, I removed my Chicago Bulls cap to show respect. I saw that other visitors had tied tobacco offerings in small cloth pouches to the fence to honor and carry forward the spirit of the martyrs. I had no tobacco to offer, just time and prayers. On December 29th, 1890, the 7th Cavalry of the United States Army gunned down mostly unarmed men, women, and children who had been traveling from the Cheyenne River Reservation under the leadership of Chief Bigfoot and were camped in the ravine below this hill. The smoke was so dense, said White Lance, a survivor, I couldn't see anything. Their shooting was so reckless that some American soldiers accidentally killed their brothers in arms. After the first mass murder of Lakota in their camp, soldiers chased fleeing survivors across the prairie for hours, executing them at close range. They left the bodies littered across the plain. 2 days later, a blizzard rolled in. Then the army hired civilians to collect the frozen corpses, buried in snow, paying $2 for each Indian interred on the hill. For actions at Wounded Knee, the Army awarded 20 soldiers the Medal of Honor, its highest commendation for war heroes. Their citations praised, quote, distinguished gallantry, extraordinary gallantry, bravery in action, distinguished bravery, and conspicuous bravery. That same year, the US Census Division announced the close of the frontier, a demographic boundary beyond which the population was less than 2 per square mile. Settlers had spread from sea to shining sea. The indigenous, it was believed, would soon go extinct. In life, many of the Army's victims were the followers of the ghost dance, a 19th century faith that originated with a vision delivered, it was said, by God to the Paiute Messiah Jack Wilson, more commonly known as Wovoka. The dance, which is an all-night ceremony where worshipers held hands and shuffled clockwise in a circle to spiritual songs, was believed to hasten the renewal of the world, the return of the ancestors, and maybe even the departure of the colonists. Ghost dancers donned shirts painted with the sun, the stars, and the moon, celestial images connecting the wearers to the heavens. These shirts made them bulletproof, according to some Lakota practitioners. Among the indigenous, the ghost dance inspired resilience and revival in the face of devastating loss and upheaval. Among some settlers and military officials, notably in South Dakota, the dance fomented fear of an Indian insurgency. Generations later, on the night of February 27th, 1973, that fear was realized when 54 cars loaded with Oglala and American Indian Movement activists descended on Wounded Knee to reclaim and liberate that hallowed ground. AIM joined already strong local opposition to Pine Ridge Tribal Chairman Dick Wilson, who had recently weathered an impeachment trial on corruption charges. Reportedly armed with weapons, including hunting rifles, rusting .22s, plastic M16s, carved wooden rifles, and a single AK-47 smuggled back from the jungles of Vietnam, AIM wasn't much of a fighting force, and the Hill was a tactical disaster to fend. But that wasn't the point. This was Wild West political theater. Following the lead of local activists, AIM declared Wounded Knee the independent Oglala Nation and delivered a list of demands to the Justice Department. Hold Senate hearings on broken treaties, investigate the Bureau of Indian Affairs, uproot corruption in South Dakota reservations, and send a White House representative to negotiate. If the Nixon administration failed to meet those demands, AIM warned, the occupiers, like their native ancestors, were willing to die for their cause. From the outset, the occupation presented a public relations crisis for the Nixon administration. Negotiate with armed radicals or risk a deadly firefight at the site of the most infamous Indian massacre in American history. And this time, the public was on the Indian side. A Harris poll released that April found that 93% of Americans had been following the occupation and that 51% were more sympathetic that 51% were more sympathetic to the occupiers than to the federal government. AIM's audacious actions, meanwhile, energized Indian country. Navajos marched in Phoenix, Tuscaroras smashed windows in Lumberton, North Carolina, Passamaquoddies burned tires on the sides of highways in Maine, and students at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, hopped in their cars and took off for Pine Ridge. 3 weeks after capturing Wounded Knee, Leonard Crow Dog, an Oglala holy man, led a ghost dance in the same gully where Bigfoot's band had been gunned down. Wearing ceremonial shirts cut from the scraps of canvas and painted with Wovoka symbology, 40 men and women, including AIM leader and Oglala tribal member Russell Means, danced for 4 days. Quote, the white man says that the 1890 massacre was the end of the wars with the Indian, that it was the end of the Indian, the end of the ghost dance. Yet here we are at war. We're still Indians and we're ghost dancing again. And the spirits of Bigfoot and his people are all around us. The risk inherent in AIM's war games, however, eventually caught up with them. After the killings of Frank Clearwater, who had come from North Carolina to support, and Buddy Lamont, who was an Oglala tribal member, both shot in firefights with authorities, tribal leaders called for an end to the occupation after 71 days. The federal government spent the next few years prosecuting AIM members, and the organization descended into dysfunction. Now, at the top of the hill, I paced that cemetery once liberated by AIM, moving clockwise like the ghost dancers, searching the hallowed grounds and my thoughts, believing the life of Bigfoot and the vision of Wovoka held buried truth and unrealized promise. I spent the better part of an hour at the top of that hill, but I found no revelation there. Instead, I gained a new vantage point from which to observe the disaster and exodus unfolding below me. From a distance, I watched the residents of this somber place slumber up and down the highway beneath a gray sky, walking to the post office empty-handed and returning with jugs of water from Governor Nome. Here on that hill, the victims of genocide. Down below, the survivors. Here, the final apocalypse of the American frontier. There, the carnage of climate change. One cataclysm hatched atop another. Wovoka's vision inverted. Maybe this is our lot as Indians, I thought to myself. The idea and the scene from which it sprang felt so hideous that they should be forgotten and hidden, perhaps on some far-off reservation like Pine Ridge, perhaps in a mind like mine. I descended the hill. Back on Bigfoot Trail, I handed $20 to Jarrett Jealous, the guy who was trying to get me with the antler keychains, and 20 to 2 elderly Native women, Deborah and Granny Redfeather, who were smoking in their parked car. It was my modest offering to the Lakota and to Wounded Knee. Now, before the arrival of European colonists, the Bay Area was a place of plenty for the first peoples, the Ohlone, who fished, hunted, and gathered in the region's wetlands, plains, and hills. Marshlands lined the shores. On the savannas, native bunch grasses stood almost as tall as an adult. Further inland, forests filled with oak trees and towering redwoods covered much of Monterey Bay, much of the coastal range that separates the bay from the Central Valley. An early European visitor to Monterey Bay, not too far to the south, of course, remarked that so many whales had approached his vessel that he could smell their spouts. Upon entering the bay, the Spanish said they saw sea lions so plentiful that they seemed to cover the entire surface of the water, quote, like a pavement. Grizzly bears, which are now extinct, of course, in California, and wolves, which only returned to the hinterlands far to the north in 2018, once hunted elk, deer, and salmon in the bay, as did the Ohlone. Quote, "There is not any country in the world which more abounds in fish and game of every description," wrote the French sea captain Jean-Francois Galop. I don't know how to say this. Jean-Francois de Gallup, Comte de La Prue, in 1789. Today, San Francisco Bay has been dredged, and the Sacramento River Delta, which feeds into it from the north, has been reshaped by levees. The marshlands have been filled, making the structures on top of them more vulnerable to the San Andreas Fault, which lies beneath. The flatlands and hills have been paved and overlaid with freeways designed to transport goods from the ports to consumers further inland. On weekday mornings and evenings, commuters from the suburbs use the same roads to get to jobs in the cities. After the Great Migration of African Americans out of the Jim Crow South, polluting infrastructure and industries began to segregate working class neighborhoods, often inhabited by people of color, from middle class ones dominated by white people. By the 2000s, a Black child born in the East Oakland flatlands lived, on average, about 15 years less than a white child born in the more affluent hills, according to the Alameda County Public Health Department. Now that bay, the bay that was plenty and the bay that was the place where Black children lived 15 years less than affluent white children, first appeared on European maps in an imperial scramble for the New World. In 1776, the Spanish built Mission San Francisco de Solano, nicknamed Mission Dolores, in San Francisco to fend off Russian advances from the north and to claim fertile Ohlone and Coast Miwok territories for their king. Mission Santa Clara de Asis and San Jose de Guadalupe followed in 1797 and 1798. Through 1821, the Spanish built 21 Catholic missions in California to claim native lands and convert native souls. Journalist Carrie McWilliams once compared this system to, quote, Nazis operating concentration camps. By 1833, Franciscan missionaries had baptized 81,586 California Indians and buried some 62,600 who perished from disease, displacement, and starvation. The Ohlone enslaved in the San Francisco, Santa Clara, and San Jose missions were among them. California's Indian population fell from 310,000 to 150,000 in 1846, when the United States annexed California. Coastal populations like the Ohlone were particularly devastated. When East Bay Ohlone lands were granted to the Peralta family in 1821, the Bay Area's indigenous population had plummeted from an estimated 17,000 before contact to less than 5,000. Under United States rule, indigenous people suffered even more. Fueled by racial Darwinist ideas about indigenous people being depraved, state and federal governments spent $1.7 million to liquidate California Indians. Quote, "The Aborigines of California are placed by those who have had the best opportunity of studying their character and disposition with the Hottentots, the Patagonians, and the Australians among the lowest of the human race." That was written by American historian and lawyer Robert Greenhow in 1844. In California's first 3 decades of statehood, indigenous numbers fell again from 150,000 to 16,277. As indigenous humanity was denied, so too were indigenous land rights. California was the only part of the United States to be declared a terra nullius, a legal term meaning, quote, nobody's land. A few land cession treaties were negotiated with California tribes, but the Ohlone, the people of the Bay, were not included among them. The Senate rejected the treaties that had been drawn up and signed and imposed an injunction of secrecy on the documents. Tribes who had been promised recompense and reservations received neither. Up and down the Golden State, Native communities were left without title to their land. Laws passed in the 1850s legalized kidnapping and enslavement of Native children. The Bay Area's native population plummeted once more from 1,356 on the 1860 census to just 184 by 1910. Many survivors went into hiding. Many adopted Hispanic identities to avoid persecution. While a few dozen Ohlone and Miwok survived in silence in a small settlement called Indiantown, present-day Pleasanton, from the 1870s to the turn of the century, by 1925, the prominent anthropologist Alfred Kroeber had declared the Ohlone extinct. The last fluent speakers of the Chochenyo Ohlone language died in the 1940s. Nobody knew about us. That's what Karina Gould, an Ohlone matriarch, told me. There was this process of colonization that erased the memory of us from the Bay Area. Gould's mother was taken to the Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon, which was purpose-built to assimilate Native children. The Lashawn elder, that's Gould's mother, grew up knowing that she was Ohlone, but her mother's generation rarely talked about what that inheritance meant. Here's Gould again. It's this historical trauma that still sits with us. It's really fresh. I'm sorry, I think I'm coming down with something. I have a hard time with my throat here. Okay. So in the same way that Montgomery, Alabama is widely viewed as the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Alcatraz Island in the middle of the Bay Area should be recognized as the launch pad for the current era of Native American rights and activism. 50 years ago, on November 20th, 1969, a group of indigenous activists known as the Indians of All Tribes arrived at this former federal prison in San Francisco Bay. This is the Indians of All Tribes, by the way. They would occupy it for a year and a half, protesting the government's mistreatment of Native people, including a policy known as termination that took tribes' land and attempted to eliminate their sovereign status. The activists moved into buildings that had housed prison wardens and guards, claimed Alcatraz for all Native American people, and scrolled a message on the water tower: peace and freedom, welcome, home of the free, Indian land. Richard Oakes, that's the guy center left in the first row, a Mohawk student, iron worker, and leader of that group, said of the movement, quote, "Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea." The idea that the occupation was meant to convey was this: just as the Statue of Liberty greeted those arriving in New York, symbolizing this nation's immigrant roots, those who came through the Golden Gate Bridge would encounter Alcatraz, which was reclaimed as a symbol of indigenous rights. The activists' demand for the deed to Alcatraz Island wasn't met, and today it is part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But with their protest, the Indians of All Tribes forced the government to pay attention to the plight of Native people. By the time the occupation was over, President Richard Nixon had called for a new policy of, quote, self-determination without termination. 2 years after that occupation ended, the American Indian movement used a similar tactic at the village of Wounded Knee, site of the 1890 massacre of Lakota people by the United States Cavalry. That protest's primary achievement, like the occupation of Alcatraz, was it created a public relations crisis for Mr. Nixon and drew attention to demands for Native American rights from groups like the Indians of All Tribes and the American Indian Movement. Following this period of activism, the White House, Congress, and Supreme Court began to treat tribes and their treaty rights more favorably. There was a renaissance in Native arts, culture, literature, and much more. And Oakland, once again, was part of that renaissance. Today, this essential history, though, is largely overlooked. Over 1.4 million people flock to Alcatraz every single year to peer inside jail cells that once held notorious criminals like the Birdman and Al Capone, And at nearby Fisherman's Wharf, as folks I'm sure here know, vendors hawk shirts emblazoned with the austere silhouette of the penitentiary alongside refrigerator magnets and memorabilia celebrating lawmen and gangsters, the people who are till this day most associated with the island. And even in the diverse and progressive Bay Area, even in a place like Oakland, where I grew up, the Indians of all tribes and their occupation are often forgotten. Take a sip of coffee for a second here. Now at dawn on October 14th, 2019, on Indigenous Peoples Day, 18 traditional canoes representing Native communities from as far-flung places as the Klahoose First Nation in British Columbia and the Kanaka Maoli of the Hawaiian Islands departed from Aquatic Park in San Francisco. A 30-foot ocean-going canoe, its hull hewed from cedar, crewed by a dozen members of the Nisqually tribe of Washington, pulled through the breakwater first, its bow pointed at Alcatraz. The Nisqually were tailed close behind by the Northern Quest from Shwai Village in British Columbia, the yellow wooden body of their canoe painted with the crest of a white raven. They were joined by an umiak paddled by an intertribal group from Seattle, which was in turn followed by over a dozen vessels, including outriggers from Polynesia and canoes from the Northwest, from tribes like the Quileute, the Spokane, the Lummi, and many others. A tule boat, pictured here, representing the local Ohlone, its belly fashioned from reeds gathered in local marshes, was among the last of the flotilla to leave the beach. Antonio Moreno, that's the guy at the front, its skipper and the artisan who made the vessel, paddled his craft and crew of two out into open water, the bulrush sidewalls of his canoe barely rising above the waves. He made it all the way out to the former federal prison and touched its craggy shore. For just that day, or maybe even just that morning, those canoes made it possible to see Alcatraz as what it is for Native people, a symbol of our rights, resistance, and persistence, an island reclaimed by our elders half a century ago, an idea, a story, and a moment of organized action that bent the arc of justice in favor of the Indigenous. On Wednesday, November 20th, 2019, the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the occupation, Native Americans returned to the island for a celebration to carry forward the legacy of that occupation for the next 50 years. Since the Alcatraz occupation, much Native American activism has aimed simply to make this country's first peoples more visible. From the earliest days of colonization, Europeans conceptualized North America as empty land free for the taking. To this day, Native Americans, who make up about 2% of the United States population, are rarely seen in Hollywood, cable television studios, or the newsrooms of most major media outlets. We're underrepresented in Congress boardrooms and universities while being overrepresented in prisons. It's easy for many Americans to forget that we exist. That's why the Alcatraz occupation mattered and still matters. It put Native Americans on the national agenda. 46 years later, the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline did the same. And like the occupation of Alcatraz, its memory and influence will almost surely endure, if not in the minds of all Americans, then certainly in the minds of the Indigenous. In the fall of 2019, after the canoes paying tribute to the Alcatraz occupation circled the island, skippers and pullers gathered on the boardwalk at Aquatic Park in San Francisco to share songs, dances, gifts, and stories about what the occupation meant to our families and our people. A man named Solustu Moses of the Spokane tribe told the story of a Salish ancestor, a warrior and chief imprisoned on the island during the Indian Wars in the 1800s. When he finished, he stood and sang a death song to honor Indigenous leaders, warriors and activists past and present. Hanford McLeod, skipper of the Nisqually canoe, spoke of his auntie, Laura McLeod, who joined the occupation when she was just a senior in high school. Lyneda Warjack, one of the original student leaders of the occupation alongside Richard Oakes, shared how much it meant to her and a new generation was carrying forward her life's work. There is something small but revelatory and potentially even transformative in the recognition that Indigenous peoples are still here and still fighting for our place on land stolen from our ancestors. 50 years after the occupation, this idea, the Alcatraz idea, can still move bodies, pull hearts, and change minds. As our people and all people face crises, catastrophic climate change, mounting inequality, creeping hate, maybe audacious and enduring Indigenous ideas like the Alcatraz occupation are exactly what we need. Now, since the 1970s, Ohlone people have worked with elders and scholars to revitalize their language and culture as they reassert rights to ancestral lands. Back to Karina Gould. We made it cool to be Ohlone again in the Bay Area. Janella Rose, Gould's partner in organizing, sorry, geez, my throat is really hurting. So in the 1990s, Karina Gould and her partner in organizing, Janella LaRose, started fielding calls from workers and residents who were unearthing bones of Ohlone ancestors. For almost a century, the Ohlone had not owned a single parcel of land in the East Bay. In 1999, the tribe, one of hundreds that are not recognized by the federal government, wasn't even eligible to repatriate artifacts and ancestral remains through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And when Bay Street, which opened when I was a kid, opened, Gould could not file to reclaim her ancestors' remains, which were unearthed by the development of that mall. And even if she could, she told me that she had no land in which they could be returned. All she could do from then until many years later was honor their memory. Now in 2005, Gould and her partner in organizing, Janella LaRose, returned from an anti-nuclear proliferation walk on the East Coast. And their group, Indian People Organizing for Change, started putting together a similar sort of walk from the shell mounds north of the Bay Area and places like Vallejo, all the way south to places like San Jose along a circuitous, what was ultimately actually 300-mile route. And they marched as far as 18 miles every day, stopping to pray at many of the unmarked mounds buried beneath BART station streets and elder homes. They repeated that walk in 2006, 2007, and 2008. Here's Gould again. There was this total erasure, but there was almost this peace that came from walking the Bay Area, knowing that there were people who were here before and knew this land, she told me. It created a huge community of people that knew about shell mounds and were willing to talk about the things that happened. On the 5th year of that walk, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was actually expanded, allowing non-federally recognized tribes like the Ohlone to repatriate the remains of their ancestors. That year, Gould, LaRose, and their supporters walked the route in reverse, beginning in an Ohlone village site in the marshlands of the Alviso neighborhood of San Jose, and tracing the footsteps of Ohlone ancestors back to Mission San Jose de Guadalupe in present-day Fremont. They thought about bringing their forebearers home on that walk. Gould remembers it as one of the hardest. In 2011, Indian People Organizing for Change began an occupation at Glen Cove, a sacred site and gathering place and burial ground in the Carquinez Strait, known as Sogorea Te in the Karkin Ohlone language, which had been slated for redevelopment. Hundreds of people, including many who had participated in the shell mound walks, showed up to support. After 109 days, the city of Vallejo acquiesced to the pressure of the occupation and negotiated a cultural easement, but it was with the federally recognized Yochadehi and Quetzaldehi bands of Wintun. And that easement gave them right to oversee the sacred ancestral sites. It was the first ever cultural easement signed in an American city, but Gould and the Ohlone were cut out of the deal because, according to Gould, they were perceived to be too radical, and unlike the Wintun, they're not federally recognized. After that occupation, Beth Rose Middleton, a professor at the University of California, Davis, and author of Trust in the Land, invited Gould to a meeting about Native American land trusts. Land trusts were originally developed to conserve private land, but in recent years, tribes from California to Alaska have utilized the model to reclaim and protect territory and sacred sites. Quote, "These tools can be used against the purposes they were created for," Beth Rose Middleton told me. "You are almost taking land out of this capitalist regime to bring it into Indigenous ownership." At the meeting, Gould saw that many Native land trust leaders were from federally recognized tribes and that most were men. She recognized that her job was not to repatriate the land and cultural and language and remains of her ancestors, but to rematriate them. The land has been raped and taken advantage of and destroyed in a parallel way to how women have been treated at the hands of men, she told me, reflecting on the history of the colonization and development of Ohlone territory in the Bay. That's part of rematriation, women's work, she said. Women's jobs to bring life through midwifery, to sing our relatives out to the afterlife, to return them to their final resting place through song. Karina Gould and Janella LaRose went on to found the Sogorea Te Land Trust in 2012 with the stated purpose of rematriating Ohlone land. They began fielding calls from parties interested in repatriating their lands to the group. Rematriating their lands to the group. Nonprofits, community-based organizations, faith groups, LGBTQ groups, and affluent citizens are now lending support through the Shu'umi land tax that Gould and LaRose created for residents of Ohlone territory. Shu'umi means gift in Ohlone, and the tax-deductible donations are a bit of a anti-colonial twist on the traditional 501c3 model. In January of 2018, the food justice organization Planning Justice, whose land is pictured here, which helps formerly incarcerated people get back on their feet by learning how to farm, gifted a 1/4 acre of land in East Oakland on a small urban farm tucked between the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Nimitz Freeway to Sogorea Te, their first plot of land. Quote, "We have always believed that reparations are necessary." That's from Gadvin Raiders, the executive director of Planning Justice. When Sogorea Te pays down the original $600,000 land debt aided by their Shu'umi tax proceeds, Planting Justice has committed to hand over the rest of their 2-acre East Oakland nursery. Here's Gavin Raiders again. "One way we wanted to do that is to put the land in the Sogorea Te Land Trust. 4 generations of Ohlone shared prayers and songs in a ceremony attended by about 100 community members. Gould and LaRose lit a sacred fire, the first on free Ohlone land in over 100 years. It may not look like much or look like it means much, but it is so important to us," said Janella LaRose. "Even if it's a postage stamp, it doesn't matter. We are getting the land back." Here's Karina Gould. "It's our responsibility to take care of this place," she told me many months later. "But taking care of this place is not just for us to do. There are thousands of people that live in our lands now. And so now that you live in our lands, it is also your responsibility, because this land also takes care of you. Those prayers that our ancestors put down for thousands of years also take care of you and your family." All right, and with that, I'm going to take a big sip of my coffee. I hope I don't have the Rona here, and I think it's time for some questions. I think I went a few minutes over, but we still have a few minutes to do that.
It's amazing how something like a sore throat will make you think you have the Rona now. I've been in that boat all day. I've been actually texting Kim like, do I have the Rona? She's like, you need to relax. You're fine. So I hope that you're fine as well. Thank you so much, Julian, for that lecture. It was very informative and powerful. At this point, we will open up the floor to anyone who might have a question. We're getting shout out from Lala, one of our student activists here on campus, saying thank you, and from Catherine saying grateful for your time. Unfortunately, she has to head to another meeting. Thank you so much for coming, Catherine. Would anyone have a question or like to bring in your voice into the space? Could be a form of dialogue, response to the content of Julian's lecture. Now will be the time to do that. You can either drop it into the chat, or if you would like, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Because I don't believe you have the option to unmute yourself. So. Sure, Jessica. Okay, Jessica, you're good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi, Julian. Thank you for everything. I do have a question. So when reclaiming land, is there something a ritual that is done to reclaim the land?
That's a good question. So there have been various ceremonies and other things, and also part of what I didn't get into is that that Corinna Gould and the Sugoriete Land Trust are also to start receiving and rematriating land. They're also relearning some of their songs and dances and things like that. So there's not like a ceremony, but I would say that there is, alongside sort of the return of land, an imperative to sort of return to culture and language and ceremony and things like that. But there's not sort of one uniform way in which that is approached, and it varies certainly by tribe and community.
Okay, I've also heard. Sorry, I'm gonna take another question. I've also heard that so certain lands, how you were saying that were entrusted to like be private for indigenous ownership, but it has been capitalized. I've heard that certain buildings, such as like IKEA over in like Berkeley or Kaiser Permanente, is actually on indigenous land, and they found like indigenous artifacts and everything before building. So is there was that like just taken, or do they like go through a process so that they can take ownership?
So do you mean the artifacts that are found and like the remains that are found? Yes. Yeah, so there's a formal law. It's called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Mm-hmm. It used to essentially exclude non-federally recognized tribes like the Ohlone from being able to have their ancestors' remains and objects returned to them, but now there is a formal process through which they can do that. And then another sort of big issue that exists in the Bay is that actually UC Berkeley still to this day actually has a lot of remains and other things. Mm-hmm. And there is sort of an ongoing effort, and part of actually the thinking for Karina and others about getting the land returned is so that eventually they might be able to reinter some of those remains in a way that feels culturally appropriate and respectful to their ancestors.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Does anyone else have anything, any questions or comments or anything? Christina's writing, powerful presentation. Thank you. I had some distractions during the talk, but I'm mystified that the Ohlone people continue to not be federally recognized. Who can we support to make that happen?
Yeah, so there was an effort at federal recognition among some Ohlone in the like, I believe 1980s, and maybe it continued through the 90s and after. But Presently, I don't believe that there is an active, among at least the Ohlone in the East Bay, there is not like an active federal recognition push. I might be wrong about that. There might be some folks working on that that I haven't heard of. But right now, the thing that I am most familiar with is the land return efforts through the Segoria Tate Land Trust.
Thank you. And Julian, can you talk a little bit more? I know every year on what is considered to be Thanksgiving, there is the occupation of Alcatraz. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, if anyone wants to get involved? I feel like I know you said you've done that in the past. Maybe you could give folks a little bit of information on how they might be able to take part if they're interested in that form of activism.
Yeah, so I mean, when we don't have a pandemic, on Indigenous Peoples Day and the day that is Thanksgiving, there is a sunrise ceremony on Alcatraz Island. It's been a thing that's been happening every year since I think sometime in the 80s, which before I was born. At this day and age, it's actually really popular. So if you want to take part in it in the future after we don't have the coronavirus, I suggest you try to get the tickets and things like that early. There are, I would say also there are like essential Native community organizations in the Bay Area that support the community broadly speaking, and then some that work very specifically on the sunrise ceremony at Alcatraz. So the sunrise ceremony is usually put on by a few groups, including the International Indian Treaty Council, which is the organization that is often doing the sunrise ceremony. And then in the East Bay and in Oakland, the Intertribal Friendship House, which is essentially the Native American community center in Oakland. It's actually the third oldest in the country, which is really cool. A lot of people don't know this, but Oakland has one of the longest running and actually one of the larger urban Native communities of any city in the United States. That's another organization that is really essential to sort of creating and supporting community in the Bay. And actually IFH, the Intertribal Friendship House, is going to be celebrating its 65th anniversary coming up pretty soon here, which is very exciting.
Thank you for all of that. Christina Chin Newman just dropped into the chat that we are connected with the Mwekma Ohlone tribe through the Indigenous Acknowledgement Collective on campus, which I'm also a part of, and I think Kim is as well. So if you want to if you want to join in on these efforts, we're trying to create more connection and then also figure out about maybe supporting the Ohlone folks a little bit better, considering we haven't really done that at all. As an organization, as a university, if you want to take part and help out with that, please contact Christina Chin Newman or Claire Valderrama Wallace via email. Any other comments or thoughts, questions for Julian? Okay, Lala, let me just unmute you. There you go, you're all set, Lala.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how do you think that we can fight against federal colonialism on our own campus? For example, right, students have been fighting, I know I've been fighting against this logo of the Pioneer for years now, and they took out the mascot, which was a really racist mascot. But now they're using it as like, oh, it's a verb now, but they're erasing the fact that it was a noun before, right? And that this logo of Pioneer, if you look it up, it has ties to colonization. How can we as students fight against institutions like the ones that we are attending?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the cooler parts of the origin story of the Alcatraz occupation is actually that many of the leaders of the occupation at Alcatraz were actually students at San Francisco State University who were part of the Third World Strike and movement that led to basically the creation of ethnic studies. And I still think to this day, obviously as someone who really believes in the power of education and classes and things like that, that those sorts of those sorts of courses and representation in faculty and curriculum are really important and essential. And just from my experience in college and after, I think institutions really often do need to be pushed in those directions to hire faculty on those subjects, to teach courses, to do things like that. I think also, having the kinds of, and I'm sure that I don't want to, speak for what is and is not at Cal State East Bay because I don't know. But, I think having things like programming and other things to support Native students and other students to, make sure that they're able to succeed in the university setting, which is obviously a real challenge coming from particular backgrounds, I think is incredibly important. And then, I do think that things like, symbols and mascots and all that sort of stuff, really do matter. So, I think pushing to change those things is really important. And then lastly, when I was an undergraduate, we pushed to get a plaque on the actual campus to acknowledge the land that the campus was on. And we actually won that campaign. And I think things like that can just, encourage people to engage with curriculum, engage with students, faculty, and also the place of campus, in a way that is, acknowledging, the value of Native knowledge and history and presence and all that sort of stuff is really important. And I think I really think that student activism is awesome. There's obviously a really strong student activist tradition going back for generations in the Bay, and I think that that's something that should be supported and encouraged on campuses.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. We are a little bit over time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's calendars. But if you have one more question or thought you'd like, now is the time to make your voice heard. Let's see. Let me open up this chat. So Jessica writes, at Ohlone Community College, I know they were trying to fight to change the logo and mascot so it does not depict renegades as savages. Yeah, this has been a thing for a while. And actually, our school just got called out, I think it was 2 years ago, in a paper. We were one of the last couple schools that had the pioneer, and I think the other one might have also been a pioneer, some sort of gold rush imagery. And so that kind of helped to give the students who were protesting a little bit more push to say, okay, no, we really need to get this mascot gone because this is inappropriate and hurtful and hateful. Okay, anyone else have anything before we let Julian go on his way about his day? Okay, well, thank you so much, Julian, for your talk today. It was very informative. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Julian dropped his information in the chat for folks. If you are interested in reaching out, I would suggest copying that before you leave. And with that, thank you all so much. Keep an eye out for our evaluations. We'll be emailing them to you shortly after this program. And like I said earlier, please sign up for future lectures as well. And we will see you all soon. Have a great rest of your week and take care. Bye, everybody. Thank you, Julian.